All right, Chillcast MMA, and I'm joined once again by Austin Brodie of MMAPanic. As always, you guys can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. You can find Austin at MMAPanic on Twitter. So, what's up, Austin? What's going on? We had a crazy weekend in the world of MMA. We can just hop right into the topics, or we can talk about something else. But what's just been going on? It's been a crazy week, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been a crazy week. It was a crazy weekend. There were a lot of great fights, a lot of controversy and good stuff. And then heading into this week, we got two Bellator cards and another UFC card, and the Korean zombies fighting. So the times are always good when that's going on.
Yeah, it's been busy. It feels like, I guess, a product of all the cards going on lately, and everyone seems to be putting out cards every single week. There seems like there's no real off season in MMA, so it feels like the stuff from UFC 245. We're sitting here, what is it, Wednesday, and it already feels like it's somewhat old news. But I guess before we get into anything specific, we've got PFL news. Like you already said, we've got some more UFC action going down this weekend. Got Bellator news. There's always other news, little things going on inside the world of MMA. So I'm just going to throw it to you. What's the big story you feel like heading into this weekend?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest one is what we found out this morning, which was that Rory Macdonald is no longer with Bellator, and that he decided to sign with the PFL to compete in the 2020 welterweight season, which that was big news. I don't think anybody's seen that coming. I mean, he was one of the first big free agents to make the jump over from UFC to Bellator, and now he's doing that from Bellator to PFL. So it was surprising. It's kind of cool news. It's good for PFL. They're getting some higher name fighters, some skilled fighters, someone who's a former champion like him. So it's good for the PFL.
Oh, it's definitely good for the PFL, and obviously we can sit here and break that down from different angles. But Rory Macdonald, as he sits here now, he's 21-6-1. Obviously, like you just said, he signed a deal exclusively PFL multi-fight deal. So obviously that means he's going to be in their welterweight tournament, which is starting up next year. And $1 million on the line, and there's going to be a lot of talking, a lot of hand-wringing about what does this mean if he loses and doesn't win? What happens if he does win? So when you think Rory Macdonald, PFL, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Just growth. Just that PFL's had a couple seasons under their belt now. They're starting to really catch on. I think people like this the format of what's going on, especially the fighters, and especially the fighters. The likes of like Rory Macdonald, someone who's not going to come out and be Colby Covington or cause a chaos before the fight to get attention. I think that's one of the things he said about wanting to join PFL is not just that you get a chance to compete for $1 million, is that the format, there's no politics, and it just goes based off of wins. And I think a lot of fighters are like that. And so we've seen a lot of fighters come over to PFL. Jordan Johnson, who didn't even have that good of a showing this year in PFL, he was undefeated in the UFC, and then his contract came up, and he decided to go to the PFL where he could have a smooth transition to become the champion. So I think maybe it's a trend that might be starting for some of these fighters like Macdonald, who are more soft spoken but let their fighting do the talking for them.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, and that all sounds like it all sounds great in theory. And when you think about Rory Macdonald, we know that he's been through wars, and we know he's had his fair share of damage. And it's like I want to sit here and just say nothing but positive things, but I can't help but think, what does it say that guy has a shaky after all the hoopla about what was going on with free agency for this one to kind of be a little bit of a miss, and now he's just sort of shuffling over to PFL, but because it's PFL, the news comes off kind of positive. Whereas had this been, say, one championship, I think people would be looking at this as a ooh type of move. So are we looking at it like it's positive because of the $1 million? And if so, do you think that could be, if this is about the $1 million, does this bring into question that he's not an aberration and we will see higher level fighters start to trickle over to PFL? And then what does this say about Bellator? For them, this didn't even last 3 years. And for them to have acquired Rory, and then for this to really fall flat for them, like what are they getting out of this? I understand that the trade went down and there's no real structure as far as trading in MMA, but in other sports in different categories, when people try to get things back. So when you let a high profile guy like Rory just walk, what does it say about the health of Bellator? So just when you hear me say all of that, to that you say what?
Yeah, I agree with you on the $1 million thing because if not, and I think there are. I've seen some people online that were commenting on this and talking about how Rory lost the title fight at UFC, and then lost to Thompson, and then he decided to leave and step down and go to Bellator. He became champion, but then he lost his title there, and now he's trying to take another step down. I have been seeing people talk about that, and yeah, the $1 million kind of makes it more legitimate than it would be otherwise. So I definitely agree with what you're saying on that. I think that does save him in that aspect. But I think PFL is coming along, and I think their fighters are pretty skilled for the most part. So I don't think it's going to be an easy road for him by any means. But that remains to be seen, obviously. But with as far as what does it say about Bellator? Yeah, it's a little bit of a little bit of a taste of their own medicine, not in a negative way, but a lot of people were leaving the UFC and saying, well, we want to go to Bellator because the treatment of the fighters, and Scott Coker has better relationships with his fighters and stuff like that. And now it looks like some people, if this becomes a trend, if it's just Roy, it's just Roy. But if it becomes a trend, it looks like people are leaving Bellator to be like, well, we like the format here because Bellator, by all accounts, treats the fighters better pay wise and just how the president treats them. But still, the money making stars or whatever it is takes top billing at Bellator. Kimbo Slice will main event. God rest his soul, he main evented every card he was on. So it's kind of a taste of their own medicine. It still was a lot of it's up in the air still. We don't know if this is just a Rory McDonald thing or if other fighters are going to see what Roy did and decide to do that too, because that is kind of what happened when he decided to go to Bellator. Him and I think Vincent went before him. I'm not quite sure on that, but that kind of turned into a little bit of a trend there. So it'll be interesting to see if that's what happens. And if it's happening to Bellator, it'll be interesting to see if it happens to UFC or One or any of these other organizations where fighters in that, and Roy's not this, but fighters in that 7 to 25 range in the division be like, hey, man, this is an opportunity for me to come down and make $1 million. So it'll be interesting to see.
If you're Rory McDonald, do you bring up in the negotiating room any of the yellow or red flags that we've seen over the past year that have sort of flown under the radar? For anyone listening, wondering what I'm referencing, things like Ali Abdelaziz, and he I always add like an extra letter when I say the last part of his name. Like I can't say Abdelaziz; it's always Abdel Mziz. Always mess that up. But whenever yeah, so he's got a management thing going on where he, compared to other management, he has a bulk of the fighters in the PFL under contract with him, which can obviously lead to, don't gotta start talking about Don King and boxing, but obviously that can lead to um, conflicts. We know about his history with WSOF. Then on the flip side, if you look at ratings, I do think there is a question if these $1 million paydays are on the line, and we've seen some things in the MMA as far as fighters. I mean, combat sports in general, as far as trying to secure a payday after the fight is over. That sounds ridiculous to say, but crazy things have happened. And when you're in the thick of your playoffs with a boost from the MLB playoffs, and you can't even crack 150,000 viewers on ESPN2, then that can sort of question the longevity of the product over time. If I'm Rory, do I go into this thinking maybe this is a one off? I'll just I feel like in general, if you're doing 3 fights, that's pretty much a trial run. But just if we're thinking grand scheme about this $1 million thing, since again, for anyone listening to me or that has heard me talk about this before, I'm only focusing on the $1 million because they are focusing on the $1 million. So if we're making that the focus, does any of what I just said factor into you signing with the PFL long term for more than one season if I have questions about the long term health of the product.
Yeah, I think it definitely has to. And like you're saying, I believe we talked about this when this first came to be, like the $1 million payouts. Like, how are they gonna afford to give? Because they don't just have a couple divisions; they have 7, 8 divisions that they're giving $1 million to each every year or so, and they're adding divisions every year, and they're adding fighters who are getting a good fight purse on top of if they win that. So yeah, how long can they sustain with being the fourth MMA? And if I don't know if they're the fourth, I imagine it goes UFC one slash Bellator and then them. So yeah, how long can they keep affording this? So if you're Rory, I think you do look at it as a short term plan. Honestly, I think you go in for the 2020 season, you look to cash out, and then see what the business is doing from there. But I don't know what kind of a contract he signed. I don't know if it was just for 1 year, if it was multiple years, or just multiple fights. I'm not real sure. But like you said, man, there's a lot of shady stuff involved with that company right now, and it's definitely something you have to think about for sure. And you got to think about somebody with that, like you said, Ali Abdelaziz. He has that high of influence on that company that they could also set it up to because the matchmaking for PFL has just kind of been random, other when it's not the playoffs. Like Kayla Harrison had a weird fight, and then her opponent kind of was supposed to be one better female lady. I forget the names, but then it went to a chick she had already beat. So they can move things around. They can do whatever they want, and it seems like they do that in favor of Abdelaziz's fighters that he manages. So I think that's all something to take into account. But if you're Rory, I think you're just looking at the opportunity to, you probably think you're far more experienced and probably more skilled than all of these guys, and it should be a good year and a good way to get back on track with your career. He had that loss to Douglas Lima, that's no shame. That's a great fighter. But then he had that loss to Saucy before that too, and people are questioning his willingness to fight. So it could be a good year to get back on track. But like you're saying, it is something to definitely watch out for because with the paychecks and stuff like that, crazier things in MMA have happened. And I mean, what if the company closes up tomorrow? Then nobody gets paid. I mean, that is something to think about for sure. And that's not something you would necessarily think about when joining the UFC or Bellator.
I mean, there's just a lot of questions still out there when it comes to the PFL. I feel like for this upcoming season in 2020, out of all 3 seasons that they've had so far, or 3, this will be their 3rd year attempting it, I think this is the one with the most questions. Just you look at things like the drug testing, and I know 3 of their fighters got popped recently by the Nevada Commission, but it's like, and that's just crazy to think that 3 fighters, I do believe all on one card, got popped after the fact. So that's just ridiculous, and that opens up a different set of questions. But it's just crazy because imagine if all 3 had won. What type of format would they leave your tournament? Like, what product are you really shipping out there then? I just feel like that's a lot of things. And they've dodged a lot of bullets. Like this whole Ali thing, and he sort of gift wrapped them a present by, now, him putting hands on someone allegedly, which is just funny because it's like MMA man. Like everyone is like a fixture. Like MMA manager slaps someone backstage gets 20,000. It's like it's so interesting, but nonetheless, it's like I feel like they gift wrap from that, but man, are they dodging a lot of bullets here. And Rory Macdonald, I would like to think in one hand, I just said Macdonald. I feel like next season all right, so I'll ask you this. Do you think he's a question mark or an asset?
Macdonald for PFL?
Yeah.
I think he's an asset because worst case scenario, he goes into PFL and gets cleaned up right away. And if that's the case, that makes PFL look more legitimate. Best case scenario, he goes in, he has an incredible performance, and you have Rory Macdonald, who's a very recognizable name and figure, and we've all seen all his amazing fights, and he's the leader of your welterweight division. So I think he's an asset. I think PFL is more of a question mark for him.
That is true, and for all the reasons we just went over. But I guess the reason why I ask is because, let's say Rory Macdonald, he debuts for their first show and does gangbusters. Let's say it's the first show to crack 500,000 for the entire duration and just does gangbusters, gate and all that. But he gets cleaned up, like you just said, he gets cleaned up early. I believe that's the last time they hit that number for the rest of that season, and I don't really know. I think because we were talking about, and I guess what's also clouding or guiding my thinking on a lot of the things I'm saying when it comes to this is just I'm thinking of the digital component. ESPN is not gonna just sit like, yeah, they didn't pay them nearly as much money as they paid the UFC for their broadcasting deal, but the thought that they're just gonna sit by and let this thing, you know, all these bullets that they're dodging, if one or two of them hit next year, and Ryan Macdonald getting cleaned up, hypothetically, because obviously the reverse could happen. But if he goes in there and takes an L and their ratings fall off again and they're back in the tube again, then I don't really know what's going to happen. And I do believe that out of all the promotions that have these deals with digital platforms, PFL is going to have the hardest time paying theirs back.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what a lot of these MMA promotions do that's smart is they build up. They'll try to get in free agents and people like that. Bellator's been great about this, but they're also building up homegrown talent. Like Bellator, you see guys like AJ McKee and stuff like that have had all their fights in Bellator, and they're grooming them to be the next stars. You don't really see that with PFL other than Kayla Harrison. Like that's the only person they promote. Basically, that's the face of the company, and I understand that. And she'll bring in eyeballs to people that want to see a dominant champion and a former Olympian. But it doesn't feel like they're doing that with really anyone else. And this is the bad part about their format. Unlike the UFC or Bellator, they can't really once you get to the playoffs or whatever, you can't really mix and match to make one of your fighters look better, give them a favorable matchup. So it ends up most people that went to the PFL this past season had at least one or two losses or whatever. So it's harder for them to have like a breakthrough person that we're all excited to see grow and develop, like an Aaron Pico or someone like that, where we all want to see them grow and develop and see them eventually become a star. I don't think PFL is really even trying to do that, other than with Kayla Harrison, and I think that's something that is going to cost them if they make it to the future. Like with all the things we've been talking about aside, if they're able to. I mean, getting fighters from other organizations is good, and I think that helps. But you're eventually going to have to build something for yourself.
Yeah, and then I guess the whole point of basically the past 18 minutes or so is just there are a lot of questions heading into this season, but like we both have admitted, and I think you agree with me, is that I think so far this is probably their biggest signing to date, period, for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that if everything goes correctly, I do think that this could be the one thing that we'll look back on by the end of next year and say, you know what, boy, did they turn that ship around fast. So it's going to be interesting to see. But moving forward, another topic I wanted to get to, UFC, the prices. You know me, I'm big on the whole prices, keeping an eye out on who's charging what to watch people punch each other. And the UFC once again changes the price. UFC pay-per-view prices are returning back to $65, starting with UFC 246. Interesting to note on this, for anyone that saw the headlines or read the articles on this is not beginning with UFC 246 and only for it. It's beginning with UFC 246 and then moving forward. We all know that this past year they took the price down from 65. I do believe they took it down from 65 to 60 to kind of offset the charge of the ESPN Plus being $5 a month. So moving forward, obviously we kind of expected that for the McGregor fight. I don't think that's too much news. But what do you think? Once again, we have another wrinkle in the paywall story, the paywall chronicles of UFC ESPN.
Yeah, I think it's bad. I think I talk about this every time where it's too expensive. The sport's too expensive to watch as it is. Like you said, like they dropped it a little bit because you have to pay for an app and then pay for the pay per view on top of the app. So they should have dropped it down. They probably should have dropped it down more. And now that they're just trying to raise it back up and be like, well, we let you have $5 off or whatever for a couple months. So it sucks. they're just going to keep raising it until people stop buying pay-per-views, which seemingly has happened this year anyway. So I don't like the pay-per-view model. I never really have, and obviously they know more financial stuff than I do, but it just sucks. As a fan, it sucks to keep getting gouged for more and more money.
So again, and for anyone listening, this is not what I'm about to say right now. For this particular portion, is not me, sharing information. This is just pure thought, um, just how I feel on it. This is going to get 1,000 times worse before it gets better. You saw when ESPN MMA rolled out their MMA page for the first two cards, or maybe they did it for the third one, highlights galore. And I'm talking about they were fast. The same way that, if the Lakers play the Clippers, within 5 minutes, House of Highlights has those highlights up. ESPN MMA was faster than that for the whole card. All of a sudden, once the subscriptions got there, they stopped doing it. Now it's just Ariel, Chael, different chopped up interviews and things of the sort, and original content. So it's a mix. Now we see with ESPN Plus, they lowered it for a little bit, which wasn't really lowering it because the UFC jacked it up to begin with, but they lowered it a little bit. And now they're going back to raising it again. And the explanation that they gave, and I'm going to actually read through some of this because this is what an ESPN Plus spokesperson said to MMA Junkie. ESPN Plus is an incredible value to its UFC fans, and this price change represents a return to the price that UFC fans traditionally paid prior to ESPN Plus, decreasing the price for pay-per-view events for most of 2019. So that's like an answer, non-answer, and they said ESPN Plus a lot, which was really throwing me off. So there's no real explanation. They basically just said, yeah, we did it. And this just feels like a giant slap in the face.
Yeah, it seems like they're just saying like, well, we initially gave you a discount because you had to pay for ESPN Plus, but now you should pay for ESPN Plus now because we have so much good MMA content. And it's like, well, I mean, that's not the argument. The argument is people that want to go buy the pay per view have to pay $10 extra, and now you're raising it up again. So it's just, I don't know. It's just that's a awful statement. I don't know why they would even make that statement, but I don't know. It just shows what's kind of been going on in the MMA for the last few years and what's going to keep going on. We're going to keep getting charged more and more and more until people stop watching.
I don't, to say that, okay, it's an incredible value to UFC fans, so therefore this change is reflecting the fact that it's just, why would you, I don't even understand why you would put a statement like that out there. But again, I tend to think the reason why this is just happening is because things did not go well. I did a preview to anyone that listened to any of the previous episodes. I said, or someone alluded to this before any of this broke, that I thought that they were going to check. We subscribed. We had a year to subscribe, download, do all of that, and now that they have all the metrics moving forward into year number 2, their actions are going to reflect the metrics that they saw. And just like Title, just like the Zone, and now with ESPN Plus and the UFC, if the subscriptions and the activity is not there, price is going up. And I just think this is a case of that.
Yeah, I agree. Especially companies like UFC doesn't even have this excuse, but companies like the Zone who are signing these multi-million-dollar contracts with all these different boxers and people, they're like, right when the company's still new and it's first starting, then it's like, yeah, that price of that's gonna skyrocket.
Yeah, and I don't know. And again, this is just, we're not information sharing. Some of this, like I said, via MMA Junkie, and I'm sure if you're a hardcore listener to this, you probably are aware of this change. And if you're not, you're pretty much going to see it soon. So again, it's just another example of paywall madness, and it is going to go strong into 2020. So I guess before we move off on this, one thing that I did want to touch on, just because I feel like it's somewhat related, talking about how this is going to get worse, because I did say that. One of the other things that was sort of on my mind when I was originally thinking about that is ways that this could continue to affect the consumer. One of the things that everyone was excited about moving from the Fox era to ESPN was ads. It seems like a little thing, but for anyone that had to sit through 6, 7 hours of Fox cards, you know what I'm talking about. When if a fight ended 30 seconds and there was a half hour to burn, you were going to get B-roll and commercials on loop until the next guys were ready to go. That's just how they operated. And I think another thing that we're going to see now, if you notice the ad templates, like in Hollywood or whatever, when they do these shows and they have to fill the commercial spots, like you look at the Super Bowl, they usually have templates. And depending on how hot this show is, it'll be diverse. If not, usually that's when you see shows where it's like, oh, I've seen this commercial like 4 or 5 times. The UFC is kind of like that. And I feel like that's another thing where it could get worse, where we slowly start to inch back towards the Fox era, where we start going like, yeah, the card did start early, but man, is this thing starting to end a little bit later. So I just think that's just another little thing to watch out for, and other little things like rolling back of content. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if eventually they stop letting the cards be instant replay because they want people to watch it live more. That could be another thing, because again, no one's really policing this, and if the subscriptions aren't there, people got to get crafty. And like we all know, and like I've said multiple times when talking about digital, most plans don't stick. 1 or 2 will. And if they find out that, hey, we can roll back one feature and increase activity by, say, 10,000 hits, it may be worth it. So just what do you think about that? Or do you think I'm just blowing smoke and no, they're just eventually going to open up the doors and let the content fall in our laps?
No, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I agree. I hope not, though. I mean, one good thing about this ESPN switch is the pace, like you've been talking about, the pace of the cards have been so much. Maybe I'm just used to this one, but they seem like they've been so much faster than the Fox era. The Fox era was straight up brutal sometimes, and I'm in the Central time zone. You're someone in the Eastern time zone. I can't even imagine. Some of those cards must have got over at like 2 in the morning. But so I hope that doesn't happen. But like you said, yeah, I mean they're gonna make their money somehow, regardless of what we want or care about. Like they're gonna find a way to make everything worth it. And if that's shoving hours and hours of paid programming down our throats, that's what they're gonna do for sure.
Yeah, and this is just, it's interesting, and I feel like changes to this ESPN UFC deal, these things are going to be fluid. And I thought that after the first year, we were pretty much done. We knew what we were going to get. Clearly not. Clearly, this thing is still in motion. So I'm sure there will be more updates to come in the future. So, all right, another topic that I wanted to talk about. But before we do that, because I guess I was going to sort of end it on that. Since we already done talked, or I mentioned said the words UFC 246, you already know where my mind is going. You already know how I am once I mention a fight or a fight card. So I'm just going to, let's call this an early preview. Let's just keep it brief, chill. So, Conor McGregor, Donald Cerrone. Who you got? Why?
I got Connor. Yeah. Uh, I and I don't know. I mean, Cowboy is really on point and on the money sometimes, and when that's the case, he's a tough guy to beat. But a lot of the times when it's been a big moment or big situation, like a title shot or something like that, he's kind of folded under pressure a little bit, and I think he might shoot him for takedowns and try to get it to the mat with Connor, but I think he'll be willing to stand up with him, and Cowboy doesn't take a whole lot of punishment. I mean, not saying he's not tough; he's a very tough guy, but doesn't take a whole lot of punishment to get him out, like we've seen with Gaethje and Dos Anjos and some of these other very, very good fighters. And it's like, I'm not saying it's going to be an easy fight for Connor, but to me, the early advantage goes to Conor McGregor. I think they gave him this matchup for a reason. Gaethje was out there with an open schedule, and so I think they gave it to him for a reason. But it's a very interesting fight. I think they did him no favors with the fight card. I mean, maybe they're just leaning heavily on Conor McGregor, his star power, but I think the co-main event's like Anthony Pettis versus Cesar Ferreira or something like that. So they didn't do him any favors on that. But just early prediction before I even like watch the tape or try to actually figure out who I think's gonna win. Gut feeling tells me Conor McGregor.
Yeah, and that's Diego Ferreira taking on Anthony Pettis in the co-main event for that one. And let's actually look at that whole card because, to your point, that is a little.
Yeah, I think they're really banking on the star power of Conor McGregor for this one.
Yeah, I mean, you got Holly Holm, Andre Feely. I mean, there are some names on there that the hardcores are out, but I guess to your point, we're used to, I guess, bigger Conor McGregor cards. But I mean, before I actually get into the early prediction, I do think this will turn out as far as pay per views. I think ESPN will get more than their fill on this one. I think they'll be all right. But what I actually got, I'm actually gonna go with Cowboy on this one. I've actually been thinking about this fight for a while. I just believe that Cowboy, while he has been one, anyone that if you're a historian, you're gonna say, oh, he might not show up because this is a big moment
Mm.
and he is older and all those things. I acknowledge all of those, but I don't believe that those things are going to go away for this fight. So why do I still believe he's going to win? Because I don't believe that Conor McGregor can get back to the form that he did when he first got on the scene, because I think that's the sharpest we saw his stand up. And even if he is at his sharpest, you're not going to one hit, two hit, get Donald Cerrone out of there. You have to attack him with a flurry. You have to go Robbie Lawler style on him and get him out of there. And not even he was able to do it like that. And I do think he's had some slow starts, but I think trying to sit back and look for a counter left hand or something, even if you do open him up and you start to stalk and get, look for a way to get him out of there, I do believe if it goes to the mat and it's still early and Donald Cerrone is not fully awake, I still trust Donald Cerrone's survival instincts on the ground more than I do Conor McGregor's ground and pound in a Donald Cerrone is staggered in his guard situation. So, and if it wears on from there, it just gets even sweeter for Cerrone. So that's without getting super technical and all that. But yeah, I'm just leaning Cerrone.
Yeah, and what I was saying about the some of the advantages Conor has, just want to make sure like that is him at his best. That's the prime Conor that we've seen. So like you said, like a lot of stuff has happened over the months. So if he shows up not focused, not prepared, and not the same guy, I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'm want to be clear. This is not an official prediction. That's why we're not sitting there talking different techniques and positions, things like that. But still, I want to be clear that I still believe that a sharp Conor McGregor with a piston left hand, fully in shape and all, I still trust Donald Cerrone half asleep in his guard, eyes swollen up because he just got. I still trust that Donald Cerrone more than I trust the finishing instincts of Conor McGregor. And we're going to dive into why I believe all of that at a later date and time. So, year end 2019, decade, all the lists, you guys have seen them by now. We've got the end of year, end of decade, fight of the year, fight of the decade, all this. So I don't want to take up too much time trying to be too specific, but just when you start to think MMA, the decade that was, what are some of the things that come to mind? What are some of the first things that pop out? We've already sort of touched on this a little bit. Um, and like I just said, there's a lot of content out there so far. But just before we get out of here, when you think MMA decade 2010, 2020, what comes to mind?
Yeah, what comes to mind to me is the great fighters. I think from 2010 up is when we've seen a real transition into like higher level mixed martial arts where everyone can strike and grapple to a certain extent. We had no. It was kind of the time where we started like losing all of the specialists and just like the amateur wrestlers and stuff like that. Where now you have to be very talented at everything, and I think that's produced some very good stars like John. We've seen the John Jones and then the Conor McGregors and then Max Holloways and some people like that. So we've seen some really talented fighters. But I think the biggest thing of the decade is Conor McGregor for sure. We've seen somebody go from the prelims to the biggest mainstream athlete in probably like 2016, 2015. He's probably the biggest mainstream athlete. So that was really cool. I mean, like him or hate him, as an MMA guy, it was kind of cool seeing seeing one of our own become like one of the biggest mainstream stars.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna piggyback off of what you were saying. When I think MMA in this decade, and I've chronicled it for anyone that's heard all this, so I don't want to regurgitate it, but to try and put a spin on it, and now that some time has passed and I can think about it a little bit more, I just think this decade we're gonna look back on it, and this was a building decade. Yes, there were some amazing fights, and every decade has its own share of amazing fights that people can break down and list and categorize, and submissions and finishes. We all get that, but just in terms of getting a structure to the sport as a whole, and I'm not just talking about the UFC, MMA as a whole got more buttoned up this past decade than I think it ever has. Money, a lot went out, but a lot more got pushed in. Sponsors, the names got bigger, the platforms got bigger. The platforms, everyone was at every turn because we all know MMA is very boom and bust. We were worried, oh man, the deal's coming. Oh no, wait, Fox. Oh man, Bellator. Oh no, wait, Paramount Network, The Zone. UFC. Oh no, the Fox. Oh no, wait, they land on ESPN. So this was a building year, and then say what you want as far as do the fighters deserve money from the Reebok deal? That took place in this decade, the Reebok deal. But in terms of building and more buttoned up, some will argue it's bad, but for those that are leaning towards the more, we want to be mainstream. There's no way, if you want to talk mainstream, getting the Reebok deal was a huge chip in that, not just for the UFC, but MMA as a whole, because it showed that it can breach the mainstream and grab one of these big companies. Yes, Reebok is, who really rocks Reebok, and we can go fashion police maybe another time. But as far as just pulling in these blue chip names, it showed that MMA can do that. And that counts for not just the UFC, but the sport as a whole. So to just wrap it up, summarize, when I think of this past decade, I think of the amount of business that was done. Hey, did you side note, did you think that we would ever see a $1 million payday in the UFC or in MMA in general? Because we saw multiple, and not all of them were for title holders.
Yeah, that's that. Like you said, yeah, we would going back to 2009, 2006, 8, 7. You would never expect that $1 million payday, and we have, like you said, fighters that aren't even champions are getting that sometimes. And then with pay-per-view points, we're having fighters that are getting 10 plus $1 million paydays, like Connor and stuff. So yeah, like the business is definitely uh, taken off to a whole new level, and hopefully it keeps going forward because I'd like for all the fighters to be getting a piece of that.
Not to rehash everything, but that's pretty much what I think. Yes, we can sit here and talk about all the negative, but moving forward, I would venture to guess what the next decade holds, just from a business standpoint. What other things, what other transitions, who's going to fall off, who's going to pick up and evolve, and what other players that we have no idea about. In 2009, heading into this decade, we didn't think, oh, ESPN. No, I remember that used to be sort of a running joke of how niche MMA was, that it only survived on forum boards. We're referencing a whole international sport here. And now to see that these players are all involved, they're all in bed heading into the new decade, I don't know what's going to happen on, the positive, how the business shakes out, but just as far as the milestone of it, and we always talk about growing the sport, this was a growth decade.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely agree.
So before we get out of here, any topics we didn't touch, we hardly touched UFC 245, but obviously you can talk about that. Um, any other MMA end of year, end of decade things on your mind? Anything you want to touch on before we get out of here?
No, no, really. I'm just wondering, and this is something I'm always wondering, but I'm wondering who's going to be the next, like big, or whether it's super talented John Jones style or Conor McGregor as far as notoriety style, star in the UFC that we don't even know of right now. And that's always kind of just the coolest question to me is like, there's probably someone we don't even know of right now that in 2 years, 3 years, maybe even sooner than that, we're gonna be like, man, it's crazy. We didn't even think about him 2 years ago, and now he's on top of the division. So that's the kind of stuff I wonder about and think about.
Yeah, it's true. And for me, before we get out of here, and again, you can find Austin on Twitter at MMAPanic. You can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. But for me, the tone, is it safe to say we're a little bit worn out of the double C's, double champ?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's raise the stakes.
Yep.
I want to see 2020 who can grab three.
Any prediction?
That's gonna Yeah, I want to see who can grab three. I'm not saying that this year it's definitely going to happen, but the tone for the going into next year, if you're still spouting out champ, people are going to look at you sideways like, okay, Connor clone. Let's raise the stakes. Let's see who can really bring it home and become the first triple champ of the UFC.
Well, Connor is speaking that on that, saying that he wants to eventually get that welterweight title. So, in Cejudo, I mean, realistically, Cejudo could come back and fight Volkanovski at 45. So, I mean, there's potential out there, but that'll be a very. I hope that's. I think it will be a very rare accomplishment, but of course, 3 years ago we were thinking about it that way about the double champ, but that's going to take a special individual that can win 3 titles in 3 different divisions. But, I mean, someone like Frankie Edgar, if a couple more judges' decisions went his way, he could be on his way to doing that at bantamweight. But, yeah, that's going to be a special one.
The way MMA is going, you just get yourself a good manager that can line you up 3 fights, 3 divisions. What Q?
Yeah, that's true.
Man. But it is interesting times for sure. And I'm sure that before the year ends, we'll have some more content on, this decade has given us a lot. We have a lot of things to look forward to. We have a lot of things to look back on, and I'm sure that we'll bring you guys more content before the year is out. But Austin, before we get out of here, let the people know where they can find you. Twitter, website.
Yep, I'm on Twitter at MMAPanic, and then the website is MMAPanic.com. Go there for some articles and some videos put up. Just did some previews for the upcoming fights this weekend for Bellator and UFC, so be sure to check those out.
All right, you heard it there, MMAPanic.com. Betting, all of that stuff. Get all that information there over at MMAPanic.com. You can find Austin on Twitter at MMAPanic. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. And I'll see you guys later on in the week.